Even though she worked full-time as a nurse, sometimes night duty, when she came back home, she would make sure that we are reading. I grew up mostly reading comic books, and she would willingly part with a few coins for me to buy the latest issue. When you read and you fall in love with stories, you then also want to become a storyteller.
Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi is a South African politician and Zulu tribal leader who founded the Inkatha Freedom Party in 1975. He speaks to us of the influence of his mother.
My mother was Princess Constance Makoko Kadini Zulu. I was fortunate to have a mother like her, not because she was of royalty, but because of the kind of person that she was. She's known for her accomplishment in music. A day after marriage, Zulu people have what is called ubulanda, a discussion between the two families of the bride and groom. That's where if the bride has a problem with migraine, for instance, or whatever disease, then the bride's family tell the groom's family. But in the case of my mother, it was said that the problem with her that she can't stop singing. She taught us the love of music. My mother played some of the ancient Zulu instruments, like the Zulu musical bow, ugubu. Then she would sing ancient songs of the Zulu people. Many people ask me sometimes as a politician, who inspired me of the great politicians. I always said I learned my politics on my mother's knee. I learned a lot about the suffering of my people through these stories.
With each other and become one party in practice. We can only trust a political party if it has to woo.
I've gone through a very difficult life, been vilified, and some people even tried to assassinate me and so on. She inspired me telling us stories about how her father suffered, how her grandfather suffered. She came from a very courageous family. They have actually had an opera, the Princess Magogo opera, which Mrs. Bongile Kumalo played my mother's role.
Sibongile Khumalo is a well-respected South African jazz singer, widely regarded as a living legend and national treasure. She tells us about who her mother was.
Mama was an incredible woman. She was this lioness. She made sure that whatever child she came into contact with, especially her own children, were secure. We were not wealthy in the materialistic sense, but we were very wealthy in how she made time. I got to understand as I grew older that a lot of what she did and how she did it was actually an expression of the feelings that she had inside of herself. She didn't talk a lot about what you must do. She lived what you must do. She showed by her actions what needs to be done.
Chris Chameleon is a popular Afrikaans South African singer and actor. He reflects on how his mother's choices influenced his life.
I was 19 days old when my mother suddenly became a single parent and my father disappeared. And she didn't have a job. Both her parents died before I was born. And She was a Cape Townian who had just come to Johannesburg, and suddenly there she was, alone, and she had to make do, and with minimal qualifications. She went and she did it. She held 2 jobs, and we had to stay in all sorts of illegal creches at the time because that was all she could afford. But she also looked at Johannesburg as a Cape Townian and decided which was the best cultural, academic environment for us to grow up in. And it was a more expensive environment, but she said, we're going to live here. She found us a small little flat on a busy street, and that's where she raised us. And so much of my life, the opportunities that have come to me have been as a consequence of those decisions.
Zakes Mda is a South African novelist, poet, and playwright. He tells us how his mother influenced him.
My mother, Rose Mda, everybody called her Sis Rose, including us, because not only was she a mother, she was everybody's sister. I see a lot of my mother in my fingers, for instance, but also inheriting that sensitivity, which makes me observe things that other people may take for granted and actually feel something about them and feel it enough to create something, to write maybe a story or paint a picture or compose a song about it.
They're always together in darkness, wishing for somewhere to play. Now give them a chance in this lonely world. They need a home where they belong.
Yvonne Chaka Chaka, dubbed the Princess of Africa, is a much-loved South African singer, songwriter, entrepreneur, humanitarian, and teacher. She tells us of the strength imbued in her by her mother.
I come from a family of 3 girls, and for as long as I remember my mother being a very, very strict woman. And today, 51 years later, I look back and I think I'm very fortunate. She protected us. She guarded us. She never allowed any Tom, Dick, and Harry to come into the house. My dad died when I was 11 years old. She never prostituted us. She never allowed anybody to take us for granted. My mother would say, if you are going to get married, make sure that you become as independent as possible. Never depend on anybody, even your so-called husbands-to-be. Love yourself first, respect yourself, and be very independent. And my mother had very little education, but she wanted us to be all educated because she didn't want us to be in anyone's mercy.
My mother, particularly, was of the view that it was important to be well educated in order to run your life the way you wanted to run it. Mama made a statement that said, "Ooh, you are such a lazy child. You better go to school and study well and be a very well-educated person. Then you will have people work for you." That's what my mother said to me.
Wendy Ackerman is a South African philanthropist who has helped many people through social development, education, conservation, human rights, and health projects. Her daughter Kathy refers to her legacy.
My parents met teaching in a night school when they were both students and he was running the organization. They were doing basic literacy and mathematics skills. My dad liked the name Wendy and he put my mum in his group, and they've been married over 60 years now. My mother was always right there next to my father, building the business with the human elements, making sure that people were fully looked after. Doesn't matter what walk of life. My mother had the time of day to sit down and talk to people. She was a mentor and is still a mentor and still talks to the students that walk through her office. People come up to me and say, "Your mother gave my child or my cousin their first break."
Education is integral to making sure that we get ourselves out of the situation that we are in. Education empowers a person to choose whatever they want to choose to be in their life, whatever.
Part of that is it's one way out of a cycle of poverty, a way to give yourself options in life.
Anywhere there's sunshine, you'll find me. And anywhere it rains at the right time, you'll find me.
In 1989, when I was in matric, I was one of those school kids who wasn't really happening. I was always a bit of an outsider because it was a fairly wealthy area, and all the kids were like, oh, why is this guy even in our school? Because my mother was, you're going to go to that school. But then my Afrikaans teacher said to me, Chris, you write such lovely essays. Write a play for the school competition. And I wrote a play for 5 people. I couldn't get 5 people together 2 days before. She said, where's the play? I said, no, I couldn't get 5 people. She said, no, you are going to do a play. I don't care what happens, you're going to do a play. So what I did that afternoon, I wrote a monologue, a one-man play. And I performed it the next night, and I won all the prizes. It was a wonderful blessing to have been in that environment at that moment, because Katinka Heinz, one of the most well-known Afrikaans movie producers of all time, she was there. Katinka Heinz sponsored me at the Grahamstown Festival later that year to put this play on, and there I was, a school kid, doing my first professional show alone at a festival. But the reason I was exposed to that was because of my mother's judgment, and because of my mother saying, this is where I want my children to be raised. So the education she chose for me and the environment she chose for me directly links to the opening up of my career.
My dad would say, he doesn't care what you read. It can be a newspaper, it can be a comic book, anything. But for these 2 hours, you're going to read something. And when I was younger, it was so irritating because you're in the middle of a game with friends and then boom, you have to go in to read. But when I became a teenager, I said I actually thank my dad for that. Once you develop that love for reading, you can never be lonely, because when you have books, you have friends. You are so self-sufficient. Once you have it, no one can take away from you.
During December holidays, we would go to the village where my grandmother lived in the Eastern Cape. Evenings would be sitting around. Each one would have to tell a story. And these were traditional stories passed from generation to generation to generation in that form. Intsomi is called Inganekwana Tsumo. But then there would come a time as we sit where we would then have to improvise our own stories. It's called ukuqweba ibali. Qwebani eleno ibali. Improvise your own story. In many instances, we would take the classical folk tale and then change it and modernize it and make it our own story, add our own elements to it. My grandmother was expert in this business of ukuqweba, of qwebing ibali. And I realized that that was a training ground for storytelling.
I'm a huge proponent of mother tongue education. What is more wonderful than a mother? The communication you have with your mother, that feeling of, okay, everything is okay. I'm with mom now. And this is the language your mom starts speaking to you, and this is the language you love. And if it's Xhosa or Venda or Tswana, Zulu, Sotho, it doesn't matter. This is the language that you know first, and it's the language that warms your heart.
Learn, study. You don't have to accept everything you get at school, but absorb it all. Then you make up your own mind afterwards.
The most important is respecting life, is respecting others, is tolerating others, and understanding the diversity of different people. My children went to multiracial schools, so they don't see color. I'm very happy that they've gotten the chances and the opportunities that I never did. So they understand some of the things that I don't understand, and I learn from them as well. But as a parent, I always want to tell my kids that you earn your respect.
She was a great example to me of sticking to your principles, of not being afraid to oppose something you disagreed with. And she also cared about me, cared about what I was doing. A loving presence, really, and a great inspiration.
She was ill. People from the village, from the township, they would be crowding in her bedroom there, sitting down on the bed, on the floor, on the chairs. Ordinary people, some not very clean, but she would treat them all as equals, as the same. They would just be there, not for anything, just to come and see Sis Rose, who's not well. The community responded to her in the same way she treated them.
For her, manners were important. You had to have manners. You had to be good-natured. My children often say, I have the look. I don't know what that is, but I know my mom had the look when she was not particularly amused by a situation and she didn't want to make a lot of noise. She could give you a look that told you, back off.
My mother was very strict, and she had to be, because she had to be the father and the mother in the household, being a single parent.
Kids are always thinking, oh, so-and-so's mom is so cool, and my mom is so strict. Your mom is strict for a reason, because that's how you learn to appreciate boundaries and knowing what is right and what is not right. And so parents not only have to teach those values to their children, but they have to show those values by the way they live their lives.
Because of her strict thinking and just wanting us to be on a straight line, I'm grateful and grateful and grateful to her. And if she wasn't like that, I probably would not have been sitting here today and talking to everybody that I'm talking to. As you grow up, finishing high school, trying to do university, trying to find a job, trying to find husbands, and being a mother, the only person who's always been there for me was my mother, because I started singing at 19, and I was quite unfortunate, as I said, to have a child just when I completed my matric. But my mother was just so strict, she said, you decided to have a child at 19, so look after your child. She made me strong. I wanted to have fun with my friends, but I had to remember that Mom's not going to change Temper's nappies. Mom's not going to feed Temper. Temper is my son. But she was there morally and supporting me emotionally. I had to prove myself when I started singing. And so my mom, even though she was strict, she taught me to stand up for myself, to be able to do things for myself. And in my 32 years in the music industry, I've never gone on tour, like 3 months, 5 months tour, because she said to me, you have to choose. You wanted to be a musician, you wanted to be somebody's wife as well, you wanted to be a mother to these children, so you have to be present. 28 years later, I'm still with Tiny, but I look back and I said, this is the woman who made me who I am.
Everyone looks at my grandmother. She's one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life. She's so well put together and she dresses impeccably. And that, she says, her grandmother taught her how to look after herself and how to present herself to the world.